Richard C. Hoagland, welcome to the show.
It's nice to be here.
Now, Richard, just for the audience, just tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I started out in that weird world called mainstream. I was a museum curator for many years back in Springfield, Massachusetts, at the dawn of the space age. I got very intrigued, and I started sending, letters, and we didn't have the internet then, and making phone calls to JPL as these various planetary missions were getting underway. Mariner 4, which is the first U.S. unmanned mission to Mars, went to Mars in the summer of 1965. And I put together a huge kind of exposition or celebration at the museum. They'd never done anything like this before. We actually had an open night where we brought people in the middle of the night. We had transcontinental phone lines to JPL as the spacecraft was flying by. We had live commentary. I set up the first atmospheric laser link between the museum and a broadcast facility, an NBC broadcast facility on a mountain 10 miles outside of town in Springfield, Massachusetts, through the air with the help of Perkin-Elmer, which was a major instrument and high-tech aerospace company down in southern Connecticut. And the technicians came up and they put in all the gadgets and telescopes, and we actually transmitted part of the program because we did 5 hours of radio for a local affiliate, WTIC in Hartford, which was also an NBC affiliate at that time, to memorialize man's first flyby of the planet Mars with this little spacecraft called Mariner 4. And we had some special celebrity guests, including a gentleman that I had known distantly for some time named J. Allen Hynek, a name that you might remember.
Absolutely.
And it was Allen Hynek, of course, who was an astronomer at Northwestern University, as well as being a consultant to the Air Force's Project Blue Book. And I had a lot of time that night because he was physically in Springfield. I had a lot of time to discuss with him, things that go bump in the night, UFOs and his case files and the investigations, and it really kind of set a tone because it was simultaneous with the broadcast of my career in terms of things that would get me noticed later on, and it was also at the dawn of literally manned and unmanned spaceflight to various places that we'd only dreamed about as kids, reading books and going to the library and taking out textbooks and popular science books on unusual topics. It was a very epical event, both for the people who were listening as well as my own career, and it kind of set me on a path that later on would manifest in some of the things we're going to discuss in a few minutes. But it also got me noticed by the CBS television network. And I suddenly, one day, years later, got a call, and it basically was a producer working for Walter Cronkite who called me up and said, we're helping NASA go to the moon. We're covering going to the moon. Would you like to come and work for us? And I said, into the phone like the old Bill Cosby routine, come on, who is this? Because I thought it was someone playing a joke.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. I wound up at 23 as science advisor to Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, working with people in Britain like Richard Dimbleby at the BBC, meeting a whole bunch of extraordinarily intriguing people, and being in on the ground floor as we, 40-some years ago now, 42 years this summer, went to the moon for the first time. So I've had a very solid mainstream career, which had a hint early on that I'd be looking at things that weren't exactly in the center of the road, and that's what's led me into a whole series of other investigations, which have culminated in a couple of New York Times bestsellers, in being consultant to a late-night radio show in the United States called Coast to Coast AM, and being literally at the cutting edge of what NASA's about to do next, now that the 30-year shuttle program has come to an extraordinary and very graceful end.
So, Richard, when did you realize, though, that something was wrong with NASA?
Well, that was a very slow process. When I was back with CBS, my first major hint that this agency, which I couldn't understand why all the senior people around me And I'm not talking just to CBS, because in those days, we had a very close personal relationship with everybody in the big three. Remember, we only had three networks. Fox was only a distant glimmer on the horizon, and Sky Television didn't exist. And so it was ABC, CBS, and NBC. And I kind of wondered, as we would meet in Hurley's bar, or we would meet on various remotes, or we would meet at the Cape to cover a launch or something, I wondered why they would, behind the scenes, behind NASA's back, speak of NASA as never a straight answer. NASA, never a straight answer. That was, and these were senior people. Like, I remember I was just a newbie. I was not dry behind the ears, and I kept wondering, why are they being so disrespectful of NASA? I mean, to me, NASA was, as Reagan used to say, this shining city on a hill. Why were they dissing NASA in every place except when they were talking directly to NASA people? Well, I had a real interesting moment on a Sunday afternoon, as a bunch of us were all gathered in the executive producer's office waiting for the astronauts to do a press conference on their way back from the moon. I forget which mission it was, and it was scheduled at a certain time. So I think it was on a Sunday, and there was nobody, of course, working at the bureau in 57th Street there in New York at the broadcast center. So we were there, we were, tieless and coatless and just kind of sitting around waiting for this thing to begin, watching it on our satellite feed, because we were a pioneer in those days of actually satellite transmission from other points in our long extended coverage, including ships at sea. When they would land on an aircraft carrier, we would actually take a dish, and we would have technicians and spend thousands upon thousands of dollars so we could have an uplink, because in those days, you didn't have commercial satellites. You had Telstar, you had Syncom, you had Early Bird, you had these experimental NASA spacecraft that someday would presage the whole vast, commercial communication system that we now take for granted. Well, back then it was the pioneering day, so we were pioneering several different elements all at the same time. And so we're sitting around, on the executive producer's couch this Sunday afternoon. He even broke out a nice fine bottle of whiskey from his secret stash, and we're sitting there and we're kind of raising glasses and toasting the mission and all that, waiting for our folks to get a shot at answering, or rather asking questions of the astronauts. Because the first thing that was going to be happening that had never happened in the history of NASA before is that ordinary news people, men and women from the networks, were going to be able to directly talk with astronauts in space across something like 100,000 miles as they were coming home. NASA had been very controlling up until that point during Mercury and Gemini and Apollo, where they would funnel all communications through one guy, one astronaut. They called him the Capcom, which was short for capsule communicator, back from the days of Mercury when the spacecraft looked like a capsule. And so the Capcom was the single point that NASA would use to basically keep communications on the straight and narrow and not confuse the astronauts. And, in those days it was so dangerous that you had to be very careful that while you were doing something like a press conference, something major like a technical problem that could kill them didn't wind up screwing everything up and endangering the lives of the crew. So NASA was very controlling about how the astronauts got in touch with Earth. And so this was a break with precedent. This was absolutely the first time in history that ordinary newsmen, including like Walter, were able to talk directly into space to astronauts in space coming back from the moon. So we're waiting and waiting and waiting for this press conference to begin. And, being the technical guy, I looked at the specs and the antennas and where the Earth was, and there were no technical impediments. And then the public affairs guy got on the public address system, which was going out over the nation to the television networks that were, of course, carrying all this live back then, 3 networks. And he announced that they had to wait for the astronauts to be in communication because the moon and the astronaut spacecraft, the Apollo spacecraft, had to rise above the mountains that were ringing the ground station at Goldstone, California, so they could basically have line-of-sight radio transmission. And I looked at the screen. I looked at all my folks and guys sitting around in this office just having a Sunday afternoon party
Yeah.
with their glasses and the whiskey. And I looked at the executive producer and I said, there's something wrong with that. That's not right. Now remember, I'm 23, right? Even though the network is paying me, I'm only 23. What the hell do I know, right? So they looked at me, oh, come on, Dick, there's nothing wrong. It's just NASA. They'll get their act together. So I literally took an envelope on this executive producer's desk, and I started scribbling some numbers. And then I held out the envelope because I was seated in the chair in front of his desk, which had a straight shot of the screen, and his name was Wussler, Robert Wussler. He went on to become the president of CBS News for the network. And then he went on to help Ted Turner create CNN. And I said, Robert, you got to look at this. And I showed him my numbers. I said, if NASA's telling us the truth, those mountains around Goldstone, around this tracking station, receiving the signal, would have to be 5,000 miles high. They're lying. And he looked at me, and he didn't believe me. This is the guy who's paying me to give him information, and he didn't believe me because why would NASA tell us a lie? This is an agency that in the back rooms they talked about as never a straight answer, but they couldn't bring themselves to believe that they would lie about something so obvious and major and so visible. It turned out later that one of my friends at ABC, who was a sterling space pioneer journalist named Jules Bergman, had overslept in his motel in Houston. He was going to be one of the guys who was going to be part of this huge historic first time news people get to talk to the astronauts coming home from the moon.
Yeah.
And NASA literally ground everything to a halt so that Jules Bergman, who had overslept in his motel, and I know this happens because it happened to me at CBS in New York for a major mission, like 2 or 3 missions earlier, where the hotel didn't even claim that I was even registered when the network tried to get hold of me and get me down for the coverage. So I knew it could happen. He overslept. They didn't call him. He didn't get the call, and he was late. So they held everything in suspension until Jules could get his clothes on and rush over to the Space Center and literally be on camera talking to the astronauts for the first time for the ABC television network in history, and they covered for him with a lie.
Yeah.
That was my baptism, where I realized this shining city on a hill that we thought of as NASA would, in fact, if they felt it necessary, they would tell a bold-faced lie to the press, the American people, to the world, to serve their own interests.
And if they can lie about that, they can lie about anything, I suppose.
Exactly. Of course, years later, I found out the lies went deeper and deeper and deeper. But that was, in that experience, my shock that they would twist the truth on something so trivial. I mean, why not just reset the press conference, say, there's been some kind of a glitch? But they literally said it was because the spacecraft had to rise over the mountains, ringing Goldstone, which allowed me access to the physics that proved they were lying.
So this was the sort of the starting point to start you on this journey that you've took. And obviously you've written the book Dark Mission, which was, I believe, a New York Times bestseller.
Yep, certainly was.
So let's just go straight into Dark Mission, and we'll come back to some of these other points that you've picked up, but we'll try to, if they fit into the amount of time we've got. So just tell us about Dark Mission, and what are some of the secrets that you've discovered about NASA?
Well, the major thing, which I think is important for everyone listening to understand, is that for decades, for 50 years, half a century, NASA has been represented to us as a civilian space agency. Back at the dawn of the space age, back in the 50s, when Sputnik shocked all of us, and Americans went into paroxysms of guilt and embarrassment and trying desperately to catch up to the Russians because the Cold War was in full flight, the military services here were all fighting with each other over who would control space, because, of course, space represented in the old military parlance high ground. First rule in battle, get the high ground, and therefore you shoot down on your enemy, and he's at a disadvantage, and you're going to win. Well, space represented, metaphorically as well as physically back then, the high ground. If we could dominate space, or the Russians dominate space, ultimately whoever dominated space would dominate the world, and there was a really pitched battle between East and West to dominate the planet. People these days don't remember, but we used to face nuclear warheads across the North Pole, something like 50,000 of them that could annihilate within half an hour when we got ICBMs flying back in the 60s, the entire human race. We could have become a burning cinder at a moment's notice, half an hour to fly those missiles between Russia and the United States, and we could have been a cinder, and they could have been a cinder because we would have had retaliation, what they call MAD, mutual assured destruction, which was an insane name. Anyway, that was the world that I grew up in. So the high ground was everything, and you can imagine psychologically how Americans felt when suddenly they no longer dominated the high ground after World War II.
Absolutely.
But we had a general, Dwight Eisenhower, who was president at that time. And Eisenhower tried to play down the huge military advantage of putting the first satellite in orbit, a la Sputnik, gave to the Soviet Union compared to the United States. And we were doing everything to catch up. Well, as part of this catch-up, we had all kinds of programs designed to ferret out what the Soviet Union was really doing, including a proposal that the President Eisenhower proposed to Khrushchev, who was then chairman of the Soviet Union back then, the Communist Party, which was what he called open skies. Well, open skies never was achieved. Instead, we had to, on our side, through the CIA, create a series of clandestine satellites, reconnaissance satellites, the first spy satellites in the history of modern history, modern world, and they flew in a project called Corona. Well, when Eisenhower left office, which was in the election of 1960, which was the election that brought John Kennedy into office and had defeated Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, who was running, of course, to assume, the presidency after his predecessor, Eisenhower, was forced to resign because of the two-term law. Eisenhower gave a very strange speech where he basically warned us about the military-industrial complex and this creeping militarism, which extended to the press and the Iron Triangle, the aerospace and defense contractors, and of course the Hill, the Capitol Hill, Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the House. He warned of the military-industrial complex and how, if we weren't careful, we would lose our freedoms because of this creeping control that the military-industrial complex would ultimately exert over all our lives. I did not know then, and it was a shock to me to discover years later, that NASA, which had been created by Eisenhower as this breath of fresh air in this military control effort on space between the services, in fact, in its charter was an appendage of the military, an appendage of the Department of Defense. And so I open Dark Mission, which is my 50-year history of NASA, the secret history of NASA, with the statements flat out in the NASA charter, which was, signed into law by the President Eisenhower, in the summer of 1958, that in fact NASA is not a civilian agency. It has been a secret military agency all along, in the charter, subject to not only provisions of the DoD in constitutional law, but actually subject to the DoD in terms of the National Security Advisor to the President and the National Security State, that anything that NASA finds which is deemed after a security review to be a threat to the national security of the country can be classified, can be kept secret. Well, that right there, is the entire game, Kevin. If you're not a civilian agency and you can't independently publish anything you find in the solar system, but it must go through a military review before it's allowed to be published, then it's not a civilian agency. It is totally under the thumb of the military, and so we have been living with a lie that NASA is a civilian agency for the last half century, and from there it gets much, much worse.
Well, that would keep it, wouldn't it, Richard? Very compartmentalized. And also, would it not keep it sort of very separate from any, current president as well that's in charge? I mean, what would he actually or she actually know?
Well, not necessarily, because remember, Eisenhower was what we call fully read in. It was, and JFK, I'm totally convinced from the data that JFK was totally read in. It was only after the murder of JFK, who in our model was murdered to keep these NASA secrets, and the full details are in Dark Mission. It was only after John Kennedy was killed on November 22nd, 1963, that all subsequent presidents appear to have been basically cut out of the loop. They're not, their security clearance, if you can believe this, is not high enough to actually know what's really going on, and the military has taken control under various acts and various executive orders that the president has been obviously forced through other circumstances to sign, up to now and including the most onerous one that we're living with, called the Patriot Act, which was enacted into law by George W. Bush and the Congress after 9/11. And so we have been on this slippery slope ever since Eisenhower's incredible speech warning us of the creeping control of the military-industrial complex. So now, if anything is going to come out in terms of what's really out there, and we document in Dark Mission a litany of stunning discoveries that NASA has made and has been ordered under law to hide, to sit on, to keep secret, in total contravention of its image as a civilian agency for half a century, and that has only gotten worse and worse and worse. So now, when we look at NASA missions, the first thing that we ask here is, what are they going to tell us, and what much more important stuff are they going to continue to hide?
Okay, well, we'll look at what's out there in just a minute, but is this a sort of world government secret?
Well, now that's another extension of this logic. I try, and my colleagues in Enterprise try, to stick with the facts, the things that we can prove, documents, testimony, eyewitnesses, testimony on the Hill, court transcripts, leaked information that comes from whistleblowers who try to tell the truth, to conform to the spirit of what NASA was as opposed to the letter of the law. I cannot extend this to a global situation other than by innuendo because we don't have the proof. We don't have the documents. What I can say is that the United States of America, certainly in terms of the government of Britain, is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Since World War II, the United States has been the dominant power on this planet. And it's what the United States says basically goes. Just look at your history, open a textbook, go Google, and you'll see that we have led the way in every area, certainly of the defense against the Russians and the Soviet Empire and the creeping red menace that it used to be called during the Cold War. That still obtains. We're tattered, we're frayed at the edges, we're facing huge financial problems, but we still have the most incredible military on the face of the planet. And I forget which president it was who said, walk softly but carry a big stick. Well, that was Teddy Roosevelt. We don't walk softly and we carry a very big stick. Look at the two wars that we aggressively started, even though ostensibly we were responding to attacks against us in 9/11. If you actually look at what the situation was on the ground in Afghanistan, the CIA created the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. If you look at the situation in Iraq, we struck first. There was no reason. Iraq hadn't done a damn thing to us. So we, this 800-pound gorilla, have led the world. So by innuendo, you can say that our intelligence agencies, in controlling information, are basically controlling what the world is getting to see in terms of what's out there, even though ostensibly you Europeans have your own space agency, ESA, the European Space Agency. There's a Japanese space agency, there's a Chinese, there's Indian, but it looks like America still calls the tune behind the scenes, and that's why the cracks in this shield, the cracks in this facade, the recent cracks in the cover-up, which we document in Dark Mission, and I'm going to be doing in person in Leeds in a few days, they are most critical to follow up because that's where truth lies, and that's where a total change in this situation is going to come.
Okay, so Richard, what have they found out there? I mean, what's on the moon, for example?
Well, we have found, when I say we, the space agency here, NASA, has found the ruins all over the solar system of an incredibly vast, incredibly magnificent, and incredibly dead and ancient extraterrestrial civilization. From my work and the work of many others now, which we've gotten into this game since I started this back in the 1990s, 1980s actually, 1983, we know now tonight that there are ruins all over the solar system. There are ruins on the moon, there's ancient ruins on Mars, there's ancient ruins on Mercury, there's ruins in the rings of Saturn, there's ruins on moons orbiting Saturn, there's ruins in the asteroid belt. NASA is closing in, even as we speak, on an asteroid, the second largest asteroid in the main asteroid belt, which is this ring of rubble between Mars and Jupiter, something like 250 million miles from the sun. This second largest asteroid, Vesta, from the images I'm going to show at Leeds in a few days, is covered with ancient, destroyed, and shattered ruins, and the breath of fresh air. Kevin, this is crucially important. In this 50 years of cover-up of what's really out there, for the first time in its history, NASA is showing us in unaltered form, in the images coming back from this little asteroid called Vesta, which is the size of Connecticut, a state here in the U.S., something like 300 miles across. They're showing us the ruins in undisguised form on Vesta. So I think a big change is coming, and there is going to be an extraordinary set of experiences for all of us if this model is correct in the next few weeks and months coming up to the date of 2012.
Right. And how old are some of these ruins, do you reckon?
Well, we don't have hard data. We don't have ground truth. We don't have samples. The artifacts that NASA brought back, a la the Apollo missions to the moon, and again, these are covered in Dark Mission in great detail, have never seen the light of day. We don't have any science. We don't have any dating. We don't have any peer-reviewed papers. We have nothing on the record that gives us any analytical ability to gauge the age. What we have is circumstantial evidence, which, as you know, in courts all over the world, is usually the evidence that convicts people of crimes. It's not like CSI, which is an American TV show, but it shows every week, the crime is neatly tied up where there is forensic evidence which absolutely unequivocally convicts the guilty. That's not the way the real world works. CSI is a fictional projection. In the real world, it's circumstantial evidence that most likely convinces a jury to convict the guilty and to release the innocent, with hopefully enough scientific evidence to tip the balance in what we call here proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We now have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that NASA's been hiding evidence of extraterrestrial ruins on its imagery, on its sampling data, all over the solar system, and our provisional date for when this incredible ancient civilization was at its high point, when it flourished and did astonishing things that have only come down to us now as snips and pieces of legends and mythology, is probably on the order of 65 million years. And that's a date that any schoolboy listening to this broadcast tonight is going to remember, because that's the date when the dinosaurs on Earth died. The linkage of the end of that civilization and almost the end of life on Earth in a major extinction event are not, in our developing model, accidental, but in fact are connected to a great cosmic war that was waged with unbelievable technology and weapons, and we, in this model, are the dim, distant descendants, picking up the pieces and climbing back up the ladder of civilization and technology and reaching back into space after a very long time and looking at this incredible travesty of junk and ruins and destruction and wondering what in the hell happened. except we're not doing it in public. We're not having public debates. We're not having the BBC Horizon show doing specials and documentaries on our incredible ancient past. It's all been hushed and covered up, and the space agencies of the world are pretending that there's nothing but rocks and craters and radiation out there, and it's all just natural, and we're the first, and that is the biggest lie of all.
But Richard, why have they covered it up? And why hasn't mainstream astronomy, recognized these structures that you have?
Well, you can't see this stuff from the ground with Earth-based telescopes. The resolution simply isn't good enough. Even with, what they call adaptive optics and all the neat technical tricks that are now put on major telescopes, you can't see things that are less than miles across, even as they whiz by Earth. So you need spacecraft. You need to physically go. You need to either go into orbit with high-powered cameras or land and bring home samples and photographs and all that. Well, who has done that? It hasn't been the people. It isn't, Elon Musk and SpaceX with his private space program that he hopes someday to send astronauts into space. Space has been only accessible via governments. And governments, of course, are a point of total control. There's no way to independently check on what's out there. You have to believe what you were told, unless you have folks who leak stuff out the back door, which we have, and give you clues as to where to look for the databases now in computers all over the world. And a lot of this stuff is now even online because there are whistleblowers inside the system who have been quietly posting the real data. But you have to know, A, to even begin looking, and B, you have to know where to look, and then you have to follow the clues politically as to which parts of the system are breaking down and which parts are leaking real information to assemble the tapestry, the matrix, if you will, of the magnitude of the deception historically. I mean, you asked me a moment ago why. Well, we know why. We got a document that tells us why. In the early 1960s, as the handoff was going on between the Eisenhower administration, remember the president who signed NASA into law, and the Kennedy administration, which was picking up the ball and moving it forward, to take in our, heritage of administration handing off to the next elected administration everything under its purview. There is a document which was created by NASA as soon as some of this evidence began to appear, and we call it the Brookings document. It had a more formal name, but if you go to our website, theenterprisemission.com, and you just type in a search Brookings, it will take you to this document. In fact, you can also do it through Google. Just type in Brookings report, Enterprise Mission, and it will take you right to the Enterprise Mission web pages where we have reproduced faithfully page after page of this official NASA study, which was commissioned through the famed Brookings Institution, which is a major nonprofit private think tank in Washington, D.C., again, begun after World War II. And the Brookings report basically says, I'm going to paraphrase now, if you find it, you must hide it because they can't take it. The New York Times, in December of 1961, published a synopsis of the Brookings report on the front page of that issue of the New York Times. Again, this document is on the enterprisemission.com website. It basically says, government study predicts civilization will collapse if aliens are found in space. That's the lie. The Brookings lie was that if this information was ever made public, that we are not the first, that we have ancient ancestors who built ruins. I mean, Margaret Mead, who was a very famed world anthropologist, who was on the Brookings Commission, and who I actually served with when I was the head of special projects and public affairs at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and at the Hayden Planetarium back in the early 70s. I used to have these wonderful arguments with her. I didn't know she'd been part of Brookings. Heck, I didn't even know then that Brookings existed, that this document existed. But we used to have these arguments in the middle of the night as she was stomping up and down the halls with her big walking stick because she had injured herself in some, remote field survey at some point, so she had to walk with a cane. We had arguments about if civilization would be threatened, if humans ever found out they weren't alone. Well, in the report, she actually puts it in black and white. It was felt that if NASA revealed that there were other alien intelligent life forms in space, or, and this is a very important thing, even their libraries of data and information, it would destroy human civilization because it would take away the reason that scientists get up every morning and go to work to find out new stuff. In other words, the feeling was, and still is, pervaded as an excuse, that science is so fragile that if scientists discover that they're in fact only going over the same territory and someone has been there long before and has discovered all the major stuff, they wouldn't go to work. They wouldn't want to actually even inquire because someone's done it all before and they're just following the crowd. That's the propaganda in this document, which is an official document made public under the Kennedy administration, and that foreshadows why Kennedy was killed, from the 87th Congress in the spring of 1961 is when this document came to light because it was published by the U.S. Congress. That's how we got our hands on it. That's why it wound up in federal archives, and it never was supposed to, I believe, contain this crucial section on what NASA should do if it discovered extraterrestrial life, because the document basically recommends that they should hide it, that we can't handle the truth, to quote that very famous movie.
But do you think, Richard, that mainstream science won't go along with your theories because, they've got jobs to maintain?
Well, that's down the road. Remember, we have two questions to ask. Is Brookings accurate? Is it a correct assessment of human beings? Would we all just give up, particularly scientists, just go into, pumping gas at the nearest gas station if it was discovered that they were not the first to discover relativity? They weren't the first to discover Newton's laws. They weren't the first to discover the secrets of biological immortality. That, I believe, is another level of the lie. What person, what scientist, what politician, if they're taken in a back room and given the briefing, is going to basically be responsible for the death of civilization? You got to read the headline and the story in the New York Times. Most people believe, as you know, Kevin, being in the media, most people believe what they read or see or hear in the press or on television. So if someone gives them the briefing that companions what they see on television, who is going to be strong enough to stand against it? I remember one example back when I was with CBS where John Chancellor, who was a major mainstream figure working for one of our competitive networks, NBC, John Chancellor had a huge story on the Department of Defense. He was going to break it as a scoop on the nightly news. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president who was the successor to Kennedy, literally personally called John Chancellor up, and after about an hour conversation convinced John Chancellor to sit on the story for the good of national security. This is how human beings behave. If the leader, if the authority figure, if the titular head of government or the head of your civilization says you will wind up doing irreparable harm, what individual, scientist, or celebrity or public figure is going to go against that if, in fact, they're shown evidence by a bunch of eggheads, people that they think know better than they do, that this, in fact, is what could happen? Most people don't have the balls to go against the establishment that way. They go along with the cover-up because they don't want to be responsible for killing millions of people.
Well, do you think we're ready for it, Richard?
Yes, overwhelmingly. Because there was another facet to Brookings which was very important, which has always been overlooked. Brookings recommended at the end of this document that society, government, the educational system begin a campaign of public education to bring people, the mainstream, ordinary folks, civilians, up the curve so they would not respond and freak out with the idea the human race was not alone. I mean, keep in mind what the media was portraying as aliens and alien contact back in the 1950s. We used to have a term. We called them BEMs, bug-eyed monsters. Remember all those great movies where the aliens came in, invaded, and took over the Earth, and we were toast, was the cultural mindset of the 1950s when Brookings was written, when this recommendation, which I think firmly became policy inside government, inside the White House, inside NASA, inside the DOD, firmly became policy, was adopted in the era of the McCarthyism hysterical reaction to the commies, the Soviet Union, the monsters from across the pole. I mean, we lived in an incredibly fearful society. We then went through a period of openness, and now we're back to being fearful of everything, including under our beds. I mean, look, just this morning, as we're taping this, there was this incredible, terrible explosion in Oslo, Norway. What's the first reaction everybody had? Ooh, terrorists, terrorists, somebody, bad guys, Al-Qaeda, Arabs, sneaky, slanty-eyed Arabs are doing this. Because people aren't thinking, they're now spring-loaded to instantly respond against an enemy. We have come full circle. The Patriot Act has created a whole new wave of enemies, of fear-mongers, of people we should be deathly afraid. You know, the old joke, be afraid, be deathly afraid. Fortunately, people, the ordinary mainstream, if you look at polls, have become more and more open to the idea that A, we're not alone, and B, they're not a threat, and C, we might actually learn something and catapult ourselves into a totally new historical perspective. And that's because of this education program that was quietly begun to get people to acclimate, to realize that aliens aren't necessarily the bad guys. And we could go down a litany of all the films and all the great directors and producers who have led us to this point where now the people are light years ahead of their governments, and the controllers and the people who are trying to instill what I call fear porn around this subject. And you look to films like Contact and E.T. and Star Trek and, you know, all of these stunning 2001, all of these incredible classic films and television shows that depict not the horror and the fear, but the wonder and the majesty of getting in touch with who and what is really out there and reconnecting with who we really are. And I think tonight we're at a defining moment where there is a war going on behind the scenes. Which of those versions of the future is going to prevail? Are we going to stay in our prison, in our box, behind bars, being told fearful tales by those who would control us, or are we going to break out of prison and see what's really out there and the incredible, magnificent civilization we used to be and that we can achieve again? And I think that that's why we're at this moment of historical decision-making where NASA somehow, somewhere, someone is showing us the truth, this incredible breath of fresh air, and the next few weeks and months we may see the resolution of this invisible secret war for our minds and consciousness and our future, and all of us will have to decide which future will we vote for.
Well, that's it, Richard. I mean, if you're right, how do we kill the secrecy?
By making the truth public. That's why we must, petition from all over the world, NASA, to continue to show us increasingly better and better and better images of these extraordinary ancient ruins on this little asteroid called Vesta, discovered back in the 1700s by Olbers. And we must make it public as wide and as loudly as possible in every possible forum. The internet, radio, conferences. That's why I'm coming to England. I'm coming to Leeds to show people in person on the evening of August 6th at Leeds University this astonishing data, which is official data that NASA is finally providing us, provided the system remains honest. Our vote, our input through the internet, and tons of email, even from the audience that we're talking to now, is critically important, in my opinion, to tip the balance, to tip the scales, to make us vote for freedom as opposed to tyranny.
Absolutely, and we're going to put a link on the website for this show, Richard, for your upcoming conference in the UK, and obviously your links to your website. But I just want to go back to, you touched before about the movies, and you would say then that there's a lot of disinformation and actual real facts embedded within the sort of new and upcoming sci-fi movies? And also, just tell us a bit about your friend, Gene Roddenberry.
It was the summer of 1960, fall of 68. Oh, no, 65, I believe. Yeah, 65. When Star Trek first came on the scene. And, I'm sorry, not 65, it was 66. And it was September. And my parents and my family all out were going for one of our few vacations to a summer home we'd rented for a week on Cape Cod. And I remember seeing on television a preview of this NBC show called Star Trek. And I looked at it. This was while I was still at the museum, but I hadn't received the call yet from Cronkite and those folks. And I looked at this show, and I said, oh, my gosh, I have to stay home because there was no TV out at the Cape. I have to stay home, and what I did is I stayed home, and I drove down separately to join my family, days later, so I could literally watch that first Star Trek show. And I watched it, and I looked at it, and I said, oh, my God, I've got to get in touch with the guy who did this. And it was shortly after that we discovered that Star Trek was a brief experiment on NBC that because of ratings, NBC was going to cancel. And so I got roped into, through people like Fred Pohl and Isaac Asimov and other names that I'm sure will be familiar to some of the audience, a Save Star Trek campaign using a little radio station and a radio show that I had in the afternoons, in addition to my work at the museum as curator of astronomy and space science in the latter years of 1966, 67, and 68. And we wound up, remember, this is no internet, no email, no national ability to connect everybody through Facebook and Twitter and all that. This is the hard way, phone calls and snail mail. We assembled enough people to bombard NBC with enough letters to convince them to do something that no television network in the entire history of television had ever done, to reverse their decision and to save Star Trek. And that was how I got to know Gene Roddenberry. I literally called him up in Hollywood one day, and I said, he answered the phone. And that was the beginning of our friendship and our professional association. I wound up being an unofficial advisor, a science advisor to the original Star Trek. There are certain things in Star Trek in the scripts, particularly those that were written by D.C. Fontana, that are directly due to our conversations, where I pointed out, God, I was, 19 back then? The things they were doing in the show that were wrong in terms of projection, because they had experts from JPL and NASA giving them information. Well, some of the information was not correct, and some of it, even then, they weren't properly implementing. So Gene took certain recommendations, and they got in the scripts. And someday it'll be fun, maybe if I do a public presentation where I run some of the Star Trek clips and I show people individually some of my suggestions that wound up on the screen. Gene actually sent me tapes at my request of Alexander Courage's Star Trek music. Back, again, this was unheard of, where you would have a TV show providing a private institution like a museum music or video. We would call it video. Now, there were no video tape recorders back then. There were literally audio tape recorders. So he would send me these reel-to-reels with Alexander Courage's music, and I would play them in the planetarium for the star shows that I would write and create for the general public, so they had the only Star Trek music in the planetarium anywhere in the world. I also would use some of the plot points on the show on Friday, following the nightly Star Treks on Thursday once a week. I would use it on my radio show as a way to discuss science and space and history and how the plots were really thinly disguised morality plays, which is what science fiction has been.
Sure.
And I would regale them with some stories of the stars, who actually came by my radio show and dropped in and did interviews. I had Spock, Leonard Nimoy. I had William Shatner, Captain Kirk. I also had a lot of other celebrities, people who worked for John Kennedy back then, who were senior advisors to the Kennedy administration, Because even then, I had this extraordinary fondness for the Kennedy people because Kennedy had done something that no one had thought to do up to then, to bring sci-fi into the mainstream, i.e. to commit America, the United States, to go to the moon in 1960-61. And I realized even then that this was pivotally important. Of course, now, as I say in Dark Mission, we understand why it was important, why he did it, what he was trying to achieve, and why he was ultimately killed, to keep the secret, to keep us in chains, to keep us imprisoned on this one planet, not knowing our real heritage. Well, Star Trek was a breath of fresh air where Gene Roddenberry could explore what might happen if the extraordinary benefits and riches and heritage of space were opened freely to all mankind. And so Star Trek became for me, and was for him, a kind of a tale of what could go right. And that's why I now head something called the Enterprise Mission, in both Gene's honor and his name, and Star Trek's lineal heritage of going boldly where no one had gone before. And that's why we're having this conversation.
Absolutely, Richard, and you're just a fascinating man, and I really want to get you back on to look at these other subjects in more in depth, because there's so much we haven't covered. We've covered the basics here, and time has come to an end here right now. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I certainly appreciate the time, and I look forward to seeing you in England in a few days. I appreciate spending some quality time, as we used to say.
Absolutely.
And I look forward to talking to you again and very soon.